Just gonna switch
yeah, absolutely. Go for it.
presentations here.
So Eric Wilson is the Executive Director of the Rockbridge Historical Society. He also serves as the Virginia Association of Museums Director for History Museums. And I will turn it over to him.
Excited to hear about Storer College. Several people on the call and I are starting to dig in there. So I certainly encourage people to stick with this series. Museum of the Shenandoah Valley is an important addition to the state museum community and our region. We've certainly had some nice support at the Rockbridge Historical Society from you with our collections. And it's exciting to share in the programming too. So I appreciate your efforts, Sally, and your team. And I appreciate everyone chiming in. I have to note, it's nice to note that we've got some people for this lunch and learn who are brunch and learning in Seattle. And I think depending on when dinner is in Norway, we've got a dinner and learn. So thanks for making your time. There are also a number of students on here, and I'll talk more about the importance of students to this enterprise. But you high school students are on screens all day. And I appreciate your making your time to do this. I appreciate Dr. Hazlett encouraging this as part of your sociology class or general curiosity. So I do hope students will ask questions. I kind of want students to have priority in questions, whether or not you want to identify yourselves in doing that. But thank you everyone for being here, including a number of people who have contributed to the research. Doris Keevan-Franke is here, I see. I'm not sure if Keith Winstead, one of the descendants, is or not. But some mentors who have helped me, some colleagues. So I look forward to the exchanges when we get to that. So you see here, I think what was the official title for this program, and it's gone through a few iterations. If you go to our website, this was published last summer as a news article and then a lengthier web piece. I'm going to be moving through some of the biographical information a little quickly, with the understanding that you can either go to our website, read that, we'll have slides available later, or you can go back and do that, or contact us at director@rockbridgehistory.org. So this is where I started. The man whose name is fronted here may be new to many of you, certainly was to me until several years ago. I'd known of Abraham Lincoln before. I'd actually known of the statue, but I did not know the name of the man on front who figures on the front of the statue. And with a lot of help from other folks, it became a great journey to find that has real authentic Rockbridge ties. And I think has real authentic power to change the way we understand this particular monument and maybe to think more broadly about other monuments well beyond. So the legacies of Archer Alexander, I really want to stress that and face. Two photographs of him here later in life. And here's a second title I began thinking about, and those of you who have studied English with me will note we change face to faces, just as we often change history to histories, emphasizing not just the multiplicity, but I think the plurality of perspectives is crucial. We're still thinking locally. We're thinking about variations in memory. And all these images, all sculpted by the same person, a draft sculpture. This is the statue in DC, along with Doris, the researcher I mentioned, and Keith, the descendant of Archer Alexander. And here it is more recently, and I think the framing through the chain link fence is not, that's deliberate. And we'll talk about what it means to have our vision occluded or blocked or blurred when we're trying to look at things historically, or when we try to change the lens through which we and other people look at histories and look at people. Third title, and really spurred by a slide I've known, and you'll see that we're going to look at this at different angles. It's really important to me. After some creative cropping, this is the way to go. it involves cropping Lincoln out a little bit. That too is deliberate. No disrespect, but it puts the focus squarely on this figure. It gives us a different angle of his body and his power. I mean, some of you know how big the hands of Daniel French's Lincoln Memorial statue are. I mean, this is not just foreshortening. Archer's hands are strong and powerful and meant to be seen as such as well. So that I've been living with, but I found this recently. There are a number of protest pictures from last summer in the wake of George Floyd's death, Breonna Taylor, too many others. Late June, people really started constellating around this statue in various protests to keep it up, to take it down and move it. Those protests still continue today. There's a congressional bill that is stalled to take it down. We may get to that. So I want to think about the individual levels, mostly of individuals like this. These are individuals too. I don't know them, can't speak to their experiences, though just as we read statues, we might read the people we think we see in our communities. And again, to understand how the histories are not just multiple, but change over time. Archer's life in the 1820s, in the 1870s, and the afterlives of this statue up to our own day. And even differences, I would say, between last June and this week, yesterday, frankly, are ones that are worth thinking on, taking seriously, and I think they will open up some things. So not only multiple histories, we've got multiple titles. and I like this one. How we see when we see monuments, not what do we see when we see monuments. How do we see? How do we go about seeing? How do we go about reflecting, communicating, making decisions? It's the how that I want to focus on. Okay, so a few thanks to my host organization, Rockbridge Historical Society, with our local mission, our state museum network. I saw, I don't know, at least 10 VAM members in there, former board members, colleagues. That's important work in the range of public history. And also students. I think at least 2 of the students pictured here, and I won't extra embarrass them by naming them. This was 2 years ago, a project at the local middle school in Lexington called Lilburn Downing School, the historically Black school in town that closed at desegregation. This is the alumni room of that school. It was a local Black history project to have students explore the frankly unknown, rather different histories of their school, to get a sense of that in their community. And I think in many ways, that's a parallel story to the story of Archer Alexander. What difference does it make to take an unknown story of what might be seen as a kind of generic figure, sort of just another sculpted American? And how does knowing those particular histories shape what we might want to know? And so lastly, Rockbridge County Schools, which with We Merge, where many of these students now attend, our organization works closely with the 3 school divisions here. We want to and need to translate this kind of work into schools, and with the help of VAM and our volunteers and board members at Rockbridge Historical Society, with Washington Lee VMI, we're increasingly able and committed to do that. So thanks for being here. So with RHS, as I will call us, you can find our website, rockbridgehistory.org. This year, we've put together a website we call Local Black Histories. It's built on a couple years' work, but is really built on the appetite of our members, our community neighbors, to learn new stories, to put them in different contexts. So if you go to our front page, you'll see many of them, including, I hope you can see when I'm cursoring, Archer Alexander is here, stories focused on Stonewall Jackson's slaves by Larry Spurgeon, whom I've been collaborating with and is in the call today and maybe weigh in. So we're trying to expand that all the way into the 20th century to make sure that these histories aren't lodged distantly, just in the 18th and the 19th. Local leaders and educators like the recently passed Ted Delaney set a foundation, 40 years ago with this paper that still lasts today. And this talk that I recently gave for Virginia Humanities and Frontier Culture, I think I saw Doretta Sobolewski in there steering that, will be partnered with projects we're doing with the Virginia Museum of Fine Arts for their upcoming exhibit on Natural Bridge, which will open on February 5th. And again, to bring some of these lesser known African-American histories, regional and community histories toward more of a state and a national scale. Okay? It's a bigger context on our mission. So names, with a nod to Juliet. Names matter, how we say them, whose names we say. And in the record, you will see these different names used, and I will use them differently, hopefully mindfully, but in different contexts. Archer Alexander is not named on either of the two monuments, memorials that we're going to look at. Sometimes, historically, he was simply named as property of the Alexander family, or known by his first name, Archer, or nicknames, Archie, or differently spelled. Less commonly, I don't recall off the top of my head, is he accorded the title that many American men are, Mr. Alexander, but we understand him in the context of his family, when he marries and fathers. He's a son to the wider network of Alexander families by whom he was owned, and also who have genealogical ties together. Archer Alexander is the third great-grandfather of Muhammad Ali. This has certainly brought some additional press in the ways that we're drawn to iconic figures we know. It is also very important to say, I think, that Ali was not just a world heavyweight champion. He was a civil rights activist. The new movie that's coming out shows that. But in Louisville, the Civil Rights Center that is in his name and carries on that tradition, really important place to see. Hope you get there. And another third great grandson you'll see. So I believe that makes him fourth cousins to Muhammad Ali. Right? These are all ways of naming the same figure. We could go to Lincoln. Do we start with President Lincoln, his highest title, rather than congressman or lawyer? Abraham Lincoln, right? A little more familiarly known. Or do we go to Abe Lincoln and Honest Abe or Father Abraham, these kind of legendary terms? The great emancipator, certainly here. Do we understand him as a political figure? When and how is he invoked as the founder of the Republican Party? And how is that understood in the 1860s in the North or in Rockbridge? And how are the claims to the founder of the Republican Party still being rather variously made today? So names matter, and they certainly matter when you etch them into granite, cast them in bronze. They matter when you record them in, in videos and you can't edit them out and you make a mistake. So it's important to try to get them right. So here are the two memorials that we're really going to centrally focus on. They're, quote unquote, the same bronze cast. They're sculpted by Thomas Ball, 1870s. The original one is in Lincoln Park. It's about 12 blocks east of the Capitol on East Capitol Street, in the park that was named for Lincoln. Again, I'm giving you different angles here because as with all, I think, three-dimensional art and most two-dimensional art, if you look at it from different angles, you'll see different things and different perspectives. There are different inscriptions. We get Emancipation on both, but there's a different plaque here. Here we have a race set free and the country at peace. So our race goes to Alexander. Lincoln rests from his labors. He rests in peace. He's the one who labored. We don't hear about the labor of the race that has been set free from its labors, but that's how that inscription rolls. They go up in near the same years. It's important that this is in the nation's capital. It's important that Boston, is an important cradle of Liberty City. We're near the Boston Common. We'll talk about location, but they're different. Okay, and what is happening right now? 3 weeks ago, there's another board meeting coming up in Boston next Tuesday. We're changing the status and the fate of these statues and the voice of the communities that do get a say in them. Okay, I'll also say these names too differ. You will see just these two statues called by all the following names. The plaque in DC heads it as Freedom Memorial. It's a memorial not to Lincoln, not to freedmen, not by freedmen who possessed it or funded it, but to freedom itself, to a concept. Just like emancipation is a concept, it's not a person. Is the concept of emancipation controlled by Lincoln or controlled by freedmen or sometimes a singular freedman? Do we focus on the emancipation group, which is what Boston takes to calling it? Earlier on, you tend to see it more frequently called the Lincoln Monument or Lincoln's Memorial, a little less so those today. And currently under the federal statute, not statue, that is before Congress, but stalled, about to be reintroduced by Representative from DC, Eleanor Holmes Norton, is calling for the removal of that statue. And they call it, in the title of the bill, the Emancipation Statue Removal Act. So what do we got? 8, 9 different names there. Not really going to lean in and say they're wrong. I will lean in and say they're different and they signal and signify differently. And I try to think of that strategically when I'm thinking about how to talk about this. DC, here's me playing with Google Maps as best I can. I can't see the park because my screen is blocked. I hope people can see over here Lincoln Park. 1 mile exactly from the US Capitol. The inauguration was on the West Steps yesterday, the invasion of the Capitol. Came kind of through both sides, if I remember right. But the proximity is important. The Capitol was being built during the Civil War by Lincoln's express charge. I think that was mentioned by one of the senators yesterday in introduction. As its own kind of memorial to national identity and also to sacrifice. But you can walk from Lincoln Park to the Capitol, to the White House, and even to Ford's Theater, where Lincoln was fatally shot right about here. It's in a tight area. It's intimate. And the proximity of that memorial landscape is, I think, absolutely crucial to the way we might understand this constellation of figures. It's very different than Boston. Okay, this is in the nation's capital, and it's part of a series of things that have to do with government, liberty, loss, and you can see over here a view of that. This is, I believe, basically over here, you would be Lincoln looking that way. Archer would be looking out south at this point. We'll talk about how and why the orientation of the Lincoln statue was moved from its installation in 1876. It was looking to the Capitol, to the west. In 1974, it was turned to face the east when a new statue went in. It's a fascinating moment to think about why you would do that. And frankly, doesn't matter to know to anybody who didn't know that. Would we know that? bigger trip. Let's go back from DC to where Archer Alexander lived after the Civil War, after emancipating himself, after finding freedom with his wife, and with, we could call him the safekeeper, the mentor, William Greenleaf Eliot, who put Archer in a position to become the model for that statue. Okay, they lived in the, we'll call it the St. Louis area, St. Charles, St. Louis, Washington University will figure here. We're going to have Washington and Lee University. We got Washington University. We've got George Washington on statues. And we've even got George Washington National Forest, I see here in our backyard. So just to get a sense of that, I think on the other map, yeah, so 800 miles. Here I'm told by Google, if you walked it, this would be about 237 miles from, well, it is 237 miles, and it would be, I'm sorry, hours, 770 miles. If you walked from Washington and Lee to St. Louis, which we'll see in effect, is not all walking. There are different modes of transportation along the way, but a 55-person caravan, including Archer, his future wife, his infant son, his owner's family, would go there in this moment of Western migration, still in the age of enslavement, but in a new opportunity to emancipate himself and to wait for the full national emancipations of the 13th Amendment 6 months after the end of the Civil War. And the last map here in Rockbridge, those of you who attended Little Burn Downing Middle School, you can see it there. I took the work is the Rockbridge Historical Society. Washington and Lee, for whom there are important ties here. We are, 10 miles from Fairfield, and up in Fairfield is one of the historic estates that will figure here, Cherry Grove. You can still see it today, the home stands. There's a Department of Historic Resource memorial monument there. It's the home of the prominent McDowell families and later Alexander families who will figure here personally, not just broadly. So to be able to see here some of the local ties, I wanted you to see that. There was not a Walmart here, if I recall, in 1806 when Archer was born, but they do have a big footprint. So I mentioned Cherry Grove, and while Archer himself did not live there, families involved in his life did. The former governor of Virginia, one of two governors, along with John Letcher in the era, was born there. His granddaughter, Jessie McDowell Benton Fremont, who we'll see was born there. She'll play an important activist role in American politics and in Archer's story. So last, I cannot get COVID time right. July 2019. I hope I'm getting the dates right, Doris. Doris Keaton-Frank, a genealogist, historian, creator of a blog and an upcoming book you'll see. And Keith Winstead, who is the descendant of Archer, visited here to do research, to see what they could see, and to meet themselves descendants of other wings of the Alexander family. And Keith Winstead from Louisville, also where his great-great-grandfather Wesley lived, and Cassius Clay was born. Muhammad Ali was born as well. Came from there for a historical meeting. Family histories are important to a lot of you on the call and to a lot of us generally. And this was a neat meeting of different threads. We had earlier in the show an image of people who couldn't talk to one another were looking in different directions, and there are fair reasons for that. But there are also opportunities to find our ways into personal company, as well as to different historic sites that might shape our understanding and others in history. This is the blog. Doris Giebenfrank has gone. I highly encourage you to visit it. It still grows in lots of different ways. I've drawn so much of the biographical information from here and from our local archives and the partners at Washington Lee who've done that. Byron Fadley may be here, and thank you, Byron, for that work. But you can search, all sorts of things. You can find more about the bill to remove it. And if you so choose, a petition to work against that, to share your voice. There are ways to do that in Boston as well, to share your thoughts for or against these kinds of things. So this is a good and important means of public history. A blog is a certain kind of memorial. It's a more dynamic one. It has further reach. They tend to change. But I'm going to kind of telescope a bit more quickly here through some of the history, knowing you can go back to find this online. You see a lot of text, okay? Archer's born in 1806. We know his parents' first names. We know they lived in the South River area, sort of northeasterly Rockbridge County. Archer is inherited from, by different chains of ownership. His father is sold south. And there's a quote, I think it's a neighbor of the family, I'd have to check, but a kind of resonant, haunting quote that Archer Alexander's father, Alec, and I think you have to hear the name Alexander and Alec, right? I mean, it's almost like Alexander in some way. That he was too uppity and had somehow acquired the skill of being able to read. We know that enslaved literacy was illegal, but was happening in the area. And above and beyond that, he actually talked about being free in the company of people who are evidently not happy to hear that talk. As with so many people in the growing internal slave trade of this era, he would never see his father again. And when Archer went west, he would never see his mother again. This is not uncommon. See here, just before they left at Washington College, now Washington Lee, gets its foundation from a generous bequest by President Washington of Canal Stock. They also get land and human property, largely through a man named John Robinson. And you can see they continue to make money from that by hiring their enslaved property out in the community. There are 20 likely Negroes. Likely doesn't mean they're just kind of waiting to figure out who that will be. It means they're going to work hard for you. And you can see here, Alexanders are deeply threaded through Washington College as well as the community. This is not the same John Alexander we saw who died, but this would be posted in the city of Lexington. This is part of our own town landscape, men, women, boys, and girls. Family inheritances were at the beginning of Jacksonian America, however one wants to interpret that, westward leaning, the Indian Wars, the emergence of Jacksonian democracy, different ways to interpret that. A lot of the students on the call are going to get that next year in US history again. And maybe let's think about local angles here that can help us see, well, what did Jacksonian democracy look like in Rockbridge County? And when we ask that question, we also ask for whom? 1829, often, obviously, families hit financial hard times. Sometimes with estates and inheritances, it becomes particularly complicated. So a family sets west, arguably with the good protection and maybe economic protection of traveling with other people to help get your way through. And you'll see a number of Rockbridge families, Alexanders, McClures, spelled differently, different wings, and the Campbells. And they're moving through the Ohio River Basin, the Middle West, across the Mississippi, 1830, right, Missouri Compromise. It's a certain kind of new start for some people, not so much a new start for others. 25 enslaved Virginians within that group, different ages, different genders, taking the risk together. Families join together, but they're also broken. There are losses. Several of the white Alexander children would later come back to Rockbridge after the loss of the parent. You could see this journey chronicled. There's a transcript of the journal at Washington and Lee. And I believe that Doris has maybe gotten all of that online or much of it and has tracked that. Worth noting that the keeper of that journal, William Campbell, well-tied himself and son to one of the first presidents or rectors of Liberty Hall, Washington Academy, and no shock there, but Samuel LeGrand Campbell married an Alexander, sister to one of the most prominent Alexanders of the area, Archibald, who was one of the early presidents at Hampton-Sydney, where some of you may have attended or may attend, and founder of the Princeton Theological Seminary. Okay, we're sort of in Rockbridge royalty, if that's the right term to use. Archer and his future wife, Louisa, who had been owned by the McClures, will go. She is a nurse to one of the children of the family who own her. It's her job to be the nurse. At the same time, we think, it seems, she is nursing her own infant son on this trip. Now, imagine taking, those of you who have traveled with small babies in cars as parents or as siblings long ways can know that challenge. She's traveling with two infants, as responsibility and care for them. And for reasons that I don't fully know, and maybe Doris does, Wesley is left in Louisville, and that will be important. Imagine leaving your child, not knowing what's going to happen next. Okay, but while they would eventually become enslaved to different families, they would reunite. We know they both, she could read and write. Can't remember his literacy off the top of my head, but they're thought to have 10 children. Okay, that's its own legacy. This is an amazing letter. Like, I could give you 10 minutes on this, but I can't. This is after he has freed himself. You'll hear about that in a second. She's still enslaved, but able to write to him. This is November of '63. To my dear husband. This is signed in her rather beautiful and legible handwriting. She not only is talking about people nearby abusing Lincoln, calling him a rascal, threatening to chop him into mincemeat, which is predictive, basically happens. And then at the end, I am your affectionate wife. Oh, and by the way, someone told me about what you were doing Saturday night. They're always telling stories. It's such a, I don't know, it's such an intimate story in the midst of everything that's happening. Don't know where her grave is. We know where his grave is in St. Louis, and the story of William Greenleaf Eliot, founder of Washington University and the promoter of the Freedmen's Memorial, and Archer himself to be the face of that. Later, Wesley Alexander, that infant son, would become the triple great-grandfather to two Louisville natives. Oh, did I miss that? Gosh, I missed the slide. Pairing Muhammad Ali and Keith Winstead. And again, those are American stories as well as local stories. How did Archer get free? He overhears a plot by Confederate sympathizers. Missouri is formally a Union state, but deeply riven. Between them, We're going to see there's still slave owning. It's one of the border states. Archer overhears a plot to not blow up this bridge, to saw through the timbers of it so that when the Union train comes, it'll crash. He hears it. He runs to tell the guards. These are the sort of home guards with the Union, saves them. He bolts, right? Once you've done that, you're more than usually under threat. And the Fugitive Slave Act is very much in effect here, 13 years earlier. You can see that the Army is enlisting slaves for colored troops. They will pay Union sympathizers $300 to take their property, who will be emancipated after the war. They will take the property of disloyal owners and will not pay them. Okay, and the soldiers sure weren't paid under different terms of how those troops were handled at different stages. Here in Rockbridge and Buena Vista, we see an advertisement for runaways. We know their names. We can say their names. We can say their heights. We can note their scars, their skin tone, and we know how much will be paid for their return. So we are in the midst of war, but we're still operating under some of these pre-war conditions. Greenleaf Eliot will become not just the leader of Washington University and an abolitionist leader, but appoint a commissioner for the Western Sanitary Commission. You might sort of think about the Freedmen's Bureau. You might sort of think about the Red Cross. They're aid societies during the war and after the war. Sort of directed by John C. Fremont. Some of you will know him through California or Westward Expansion. His wife, Jessie Benton Fremont, becomes a famous and important journalist, went to plead with Abraham Lincoln to help her husband out. Lincoln had sacked Fremont for emancipating Missouri slaves too early, for doing it before he had his plans in place. So she's something else. A Union spy ring is named for her. She's centrally involved in this aid society. James Yateman and Eliot as well. See that women increasingly become involved in general relief efforts, as well as the U.S. Sanitary Commission. It's slightly different, similar in purpose. These are civilian enterprises. You can see written on the boxes here, Sanitary Commission, Louisville, Kentucky. Right, so we're still in these personal haunts. A lot of women as well as men involved in the leadership of women like Elizabeth Blackwell, noted by many as America's first accredited MD, helped lead USSC, as well as the Women's Central Association for Relief during the war. So we're broadening roles of leadership. There are different ways to win a war, might be one way to put it, right? You can do espionage and run away like Archer. You can provide relief, or you can enlist with the white troops or the colored troops and bring that war to conclusion. Here's the plaque on the memorial. That I could say for sure. I can't absolutely for sure say this is Charlotte Scott, okay? This is a bit of a wiki search. I've seen it in a few spots. Some reasons I'm not totally sure about it, but we'll go with it and wonder whether or why we might want that picture to be her. She's born in Lynchburg. She's said to have died at the age of 109. That too seems maybe a stretch, and maybe there are reasons we want her to be this longest living wise sage. But we do know that she moved to Ohio. Her master, Dr. Rucker, freed her. After the war, on the day of Lincoln's death, she hears about it, and she takes what she says were the first $5 she earned as a free woman and gives it to her former master and says, you find the way to get this wherever it needs to get in order to create a monument to Lincoln. Okay, and I do believe the story is told, understood as a monument to Lincoln, or to his memory. We see here, not certainly to Archer Alexander, not necessarily to the freedmen. This is called Freedom's Memorial. Charlotte Scott is on the plaque, right? Lincoln is on the plaque. Archer Alexander is not on the plaque. I'm not telling you that's wrong. I am telling you that who we name on plaques and the terms or principles, freedom in principle or freedmen as people, those matter. But that's the origin story, right? $5. What's $5 going to do for you? Well, in time, and I may have gotten the total wrong, but all the money for that DC memorial, all the money is contributed by free people, formerly free before the war and free people, including many colored troop veterans. That is critical to understand the backstory of this war. It is not just simply a story made by white people. Partly that, but it is also made and raised by people of color. And we'll come back to that. That's key. Once it's up, and it takes a while, they want to get it on the 10th anniversary of Lincoln's death. It's a nice, tidy time. Planning takes a long time. They land it on the 11th anniversary of his death. They don't choose January 1st, 1863, the Emancipation Proclamation, or the 13th Amendment, or Appomattox, or the range of Appomattox days. John Mercer Langston, Virginia's first Black congressman, I think he's the first, proposes, why don't we dedicate this on the day that the slaves of the District of Columbia were freed? I want to say it's like a week earlier. What if we went really local on that? These are interesting possibilities. Thousands gathered, thousands. And by this time, we have the 14th Amendment and the 15th Amendment bringing new citizenship rights and voting rights, at least to Black men. John Mercer Langston, who was a co-organizer, said there were over 100,000 in the parade, and he would say that, right? We've seen people have stakes in giving the numbers they want people to see about their parades or the importance of their monuments. But the installation of this monument's important. Here's some of the versions that it could have been that didn't happen. A female sculptor, one of America's first prominent, first professional, was going to go with Lincoln, and then 4 statues that variously figured the Negro in a certain kind of historical and political progression, from a shackled slave to a field laborer, which could be enslaved, could be free, to contraband, right? People who had emancipated themselves or found themselves free and were aiding the Army effort, and then those men who fully aided the Army effort in the colored troops. Big memorial, hugely expensive, didn't have a chance. Another one, this is actually, you can see the, I think it's in clay model in the Library of Congress. And it's a tiered structure that similarly works through different figures, politicians, slaves to citizens. They were gonna have sort of kneeling at liberty with the French Revolutionary cap. And then people said, no, let's put Frederick Douglass there. Again, hugely expensive, didn't happen. This is in Scotland. This is a different one in memory of Scottish American soldiers. You can see a pretty similar structure. These are the early drafts of Thomas Ball's. They look different. This slave or emancipated slave looks different. Different types of fetters, different posture. Here's that liberty cap. He's not as strong or active. And this is what we end up with. And this figure looks like this figure because that's who models. And this picture models for that. So why do we get that hair, that nose, those features? Because it's a specific human being, right? You're not just going to Google Photos and saying, well, what's a nice face that would work, right? We didn't model George Washington appropriately, but there were a few coins around and statues by then that Thomas Ball could do that. It is Archer Alexander there, though again, he is nowhere marked on any of these, but his hands are bigger. To break, sort of cloth or leather feathers, it's harder to break metal chains. See, his muscles are flexed, his head's a little higher. He's more poised. This is a different Archer than his first draft. We still do have the symbol of strength, the fasces, right? That fascist kind of strength. It's an odd counterpoint to liberty here, but a pretty common one in American iconography. But this is the Archer we go with. Frederick Douglass, I'm trying to move quick here, will give the speech. I encourage you to read this. He describes the monument favorably. These are uncommon circumstances. Later, he goes on to say, we might add something. What he does not say, and this is just months later, what he does not say is get rid of it. He says add to it. He said, I'm uncomfortable with how it is. Lincoln wasn't the prime mover. He oddly says, maybe we should have Grant here. Grant brought us the vote, the franchise. Maybe we should add Grant in Lincoln Park. Maybe the figure shouldn't be couchant or crouching and nude. Maybe he should be dressed. Maybe he shouldn't look more four-footed. He's really sort of three-pointed there, but he should be erect on his feet like a man. Fair enough. Should he be broadly named? Should it be important to recognize a runaway? Douglass was a runaway. Archer was a runaway. Might we put a Union soldier there? Douglass's sons were Union soldiers. Would you want to put a name to these people, or would you want to keep it broad? Do you want to be specific, or do you want to archetype? Okay, but Archer is the model, and it is key. It's not specifically noted, though if I were interpreting this, and I'm actually trying to weigh in with Boston and how they're reworking this, I would want Archer's details, his self-emancipation, the fact that he aided wartime service. I'd want that in the story somewhere. I don't believe that should be the most important part, but it should be in there. Let's get these some great context on how to read about all these sorts of things. Pause the film later to see them. This book actually opens with a reading of that statue and a chain of Howard University historians doing that. Howard University, the certainly most important historically Black university in DC, maybe the country. And these are the versions in Boston. They're donated, they're fundraised not by Friedman, but by a museum director, interestingly. He was also a rival of P.T. Barnum. It's about a mile from the more famous statue in Boston of the 54th Black Regiment and Colonel Shaw, memorialized to many in the film Glory. This statue, quite frankly, is in the shadow of this statue. It's literally less visible. I think it's ideologically in the shadow of it. This is more the story America, I think, wants to see today, though Robert Lowell disagreed. His famous poem said of that statue, "The monument sticks like a fishbone in the city's throat." It may be the most politically jarring piece of American poetry I can think of. And this is when Boston is going through its critical and violent racial crises in the 60s and 70s about busing. That matters to understand Boston as well. This is the group in Boston, the Arts Commission, that has, as of December 19th, taken down the memorial for future consideration, where they're looking for a home. It could come to Rockbridge. I don't think that's the right move. It could go to Springfield, the Smithsonian, but that happened 3 weeks after the statue of VMI professor and General Stonewall Jackson was moved to a battlefield, right? So we can see these in parallel. They're not the same circumstances, but, and it's, you know, it's just how it happens. The image of Lincoln here and a cloaked Alexander is its own kind of image and read in who we remember, and who tells your story. Okay, these are some things about why I think the 54th Regiment Memorial sort of wins out. We'll stick on that. I have my own thoughts, and I'm hoping we can reclaim the phrase both sides. May take 4 years to do, but it's important to think about multiple sides fairly and deliberately. But whatever we do, it's about the context. Issues I would want to consider for Boston. It is a civic land, not federal. It happened later. In the 1960s, someone tried to blow it up during Vietnam and the busing riots. We now see the context. We have to see the context in light of the Black Lives Matter movements, the Say Their Names movements, and in light of the recent protests outside and the invasion of our national capital. For my money, I think it's important that the one in DC stands in some way. I think Charlotte, I should have said Scott. Charlotte Scott matters. The Colored Troops and Freed People's Funds matter. Frederick Douglass's involvement matters. The fact that Lincoln was killed there matters. Lincoln's history in Boston is much less opaque. The relevance and importance of the US Capitol and the other sites. And there, given the Western Sanitary Commission's involvement in that statute, which was not involved in Boston, that matters. So whether and who we include in local and national memorials. Here in Rockbridge County, the 1961 memorial speaks to some people who served and not others. We see the voices of protest. This is the statue of a pioneering suffragist and educator who was added to Lincoln Park. That's why he was turned. So if you take the statue out, we still have a very prominent figure, but they're not in conversation with one another. These two figures of freedom and promise from different centuries. She's a fascinating figure to research. Doesn't show up in most high school courses. So high school students seek her out. Here in Richmond, many statues have come down, all but one on Monument Avenue. The Jeb Stuart statue has come down, and a mile away in front of the Virginia Museum of Fine Arts, a new one, believe his name is Kehinde Wiley, that's how it's pronounced, called The Rumors of War. It's the same pose, but he's a different hairstyle. He's wearing a hoodie and Nikes. And certainly the question of what war and what rumors, clearly making its own state at our state Fine Arts Museum next to our state history museum. Placement matters. Do we think about statues reflexively and knee-jerk or reflectively? I'd like y'all to marinate on that a little bit, right? How do we think about this? Deliberate, discuss, debate, and decide. And most broadly in wrapping up, like literally, where do we stand when we look at these things? Rockbridge and the nation at large. Are we looking up at a statue or a cross? And how do we see? What are we bringing to it? What do we want to see? Who do we stand with? Who is in our community? And looking ahead, where do we want to stand? And where do we want our communities to be? Right? Here's where I want to stand. And a lot of you have heard this ad nauseum. On the Capitol steps yesterday with Amanda Gorman, our youth poet laureate, her inauguration poem, I can't stress this enough, is a memorial. It is a lasting memorial. It will last longer than granite, right? Recorded words will, right? And that is a vision in the same memorial complex we might think about, okay? Who stands, who speaks, whose story we tell, and in what context. That's the legacy and the charge I give. I've taken more time than questions than I would have liked, but Sally, I will close there, and you can see in terms of time we've got, or I'm happy to stay longer, but I know you all may not be able to.
No worries, no worries. I certainly have some more time, so folks feel free to hang around a little bit as we answer any questions that come in. I do have one clarifying question that came in while you were speaking. So Faith is wondering, when you say Louisa was a nurse to a McClure child and was nursing her own baby, do you understand that word to mean that she was a wet nurse to the McClure child, or was she merely a caregiver?
That's my understanding, wet nurse. And if you think it through a little bit, to be able to nurse, you have to be, if we know she's nursing her son, it's like, let me just say, I think that's right, from the evidence I've read.
Great. Well, I'll give everyone a minute to submit any questions they have. Thank you so much, Eric. That was great. Wonderful to learn about, and a lot of ground to cover between the story of Archer Alexander and the monument itself and its construction, for sure, right up to today. Oh, I've got a message from our curator at the museum. He's recommending, yeah, he's recommending the book "They Were Her Property."
Yes,
which came out relatively recently and has an excellent discussion of wet nursing. So what it means and what it doesn't. So
yeah, it's about
recommend that book.
Women's slaveholding. And in fact, the cover of that book, I think it's like in a state capitol, it's in the rooms, emphasizes gender and politics and important. And many of you will know we're having a switch out in the national capitol, right? The Lee statue is leaving, and Barbara Johns will be entering Statuary Hall. I think I'm getting that right. So these are continued, and I would stress, that women have more place on the steps now. I mean, you're looking at the face of that. And Charlotte Scott, put that memorial in play. And Mary McLeod Bethune stands in Lincoln Park.
Yeah. I think I told you, Eric, and I was definitely thinking about it as you were speaking. I wrote a paper on the Emancipation monuments in college, and it's unbelievable how much has changed just in, however many years.
However many months.
Yeah.
I mean, you're right.
Yeah.
Do you want to add anything?
I don't think so. It was really wonderful. It's been a long time since I wrote the paper too, so I would hesitate to speak to.
I will add, and Boston has been fascinating to me. I used to live there, and so I'm staked in it. And I also took me years to find that memorial. But I've been listening in on their board meetings, the Boston Art Commission, and their decisions, and how they have gone about their decisions to remove it, I think is really important. You can agree or disagree with it, but the input that has gone into that has been extensive, and the groups that they're enlisting and still can, and what to do next. But that, the origin story there, I think it was a graduate student at Boston University sort of wrote a paper about it and put it in play, and the work and perspective in the moment, right, kind of found synergy with all that's going on, as we say, because it is going on. And we'll see. I mean, you can tune into that meeting on Tuesday night. I know you all want more Zoom meetings from afar, but it's really interesting to see how public history is being navigated there. It's not just a congressional thing. It's not just a city council, right? It's a nonprofit. Well, it's actually a city division. I've learned a lot watching them and hoping to be involved in some of the questions, not so much about the statute, where it goes. I'm going to leave that to others, but the programming and the work with students and children, like getting Archer Alexander's story into Boston school kids' heads and getting it online so that's available. Like that's a game worth working at. Like, I want in that game.
We have another question from Larry asking, what if the statue showed Archer Alexander standing next to Lincoln? Would that be more acceptable to those who want to remove it? Or is there concern the emphasis on Lincoln being too mythical as emancipator?
It's a sliding scale, isn't it? You know, Larry and I talked about some of these things. I mean, if you stand him up in a loincloth, it's not enough, right? If they're shaking hands, does it work? If Lincoln has his hand on a shoulder, like approve, you know, you're never going to get away from the inequity of the radically recognizable figure Lincoln, right? And even if Archer Alexander had a, you know, a hoodie with his name on it, in the way that Rumors of War did, you'd still have who is Archer Alexander, who is Charlotte Scott on the plaque. So you're never going to have that equity, and I don't know that that's important. I do surely upstanding in its figurative and literal sense matters. That mattered to Douglas. You know, I think people have misread Douglas's letter, significantly misread it. I don't think he's just saying we want somebody else. We want a free Black man there. That's part of it. But this figure of Grant, I'm fascinated by this. Douglas is all about the vote. At this point, Douglas is all about the vote. And we are all about the vote right now in 2021. We should be. And we need symbols and we need rallying points to come to terms with that. But looking at the three drafts, it's like you read drafts of Shakespeare, you read drafts of Robert Lowell's poem For the Union Dead, you come to see what matters because of what went in and what went out. Yeah. And so contests to say, and there are many of them, what would you design differently? And Boston is asking that. What would you recommend go in its place? You want an empty pedestal? Performance art space is a big recommendation. Do you want to take the pedestal down? We'll see. These things should take time.
Absolutely.
I put the word deliberate in there, not just debate and discuss, deliberate.
And Doris is reminding us to remember when the statue was erected and look at it through the eyes of that time. So definitely important there. Yeah,
this was it. I've been writing, Larry Spurgeon and I've been writing lately about Reconstruction, and you know, so that's April 1876, and that presidential election that fall was the one that fell apart, and it was brokered not by the popular vote, but by, you know, congressional deal, party deal that gave Republicans the presidency, Rutherford Hayes, and took the troops out of the South and ended Reconstruction and brought in Jim Crow. And that is the moment that Freedom Statue goes up, right? And when did Jeb Stuart statue go up? 1907, right? When did Stonewall Jackson Cemetery statue go up? 1891. I think the VMI one, sculpted by Confederate soldier, VMI grad, Jewish pioneer, Moses Ezekiel, I think that was 1911, right? These are different memorial moments into different audiences. So you're absolutely right to say the timing as well as the location will continue to matter.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, thank you everyone so much, everyone who hung around for the questions. I'm going to go ahead and pause the recording.